how school lunches have changed in 100 years. There were no school lunches in the early 1900s. American kids simply went home for lunch. In rural communities, they usually brought food from school. Sometimes they cooked meals at school. Students would bring the ingredients. Their teacher would provide a kettle. A communal stew would be cooked for everyone. But things were changing rapidly. Parents increasingly took jobs outside the home that left their kids with no options for lunch. Volunteer organizations sprang up in cities like Boston and Philadelphia. They provided low-cost meals for school children. A typical school meal in the 1910s cost 3 cents. By 1912, more than 40 cities across the U.S. offered them. It would include pea soup, some rice, and bread. In rural communities, the meals were organized by the PTA. Parents and teachers pooled their resources. Some schools served meals made with parent-donated ingredients, but it was still pretty sporadic and unreliable. In the 1920s, home economics arrived in schools. The idea was to teach kids to cook their own meals. Education professionals were concerned about junk foods. Everyone suddenly agreed that students needed a hot lunch. Kitchens appeared in schools. These kitchens later transformed into school cafeterias. The Great Depression brought more changes. The Department of Agriculture bought surplus food from farmers. This food was funneled into school lunch programs. Schools began serving a lot more beef, pork, and butter. Fresh apples, bananas, and vegetable soups were provided by relief organizations. But it was still inconsistent. Rural schools had no uniform lunch program. By the early 1940s, every state had federally funded programs in place. But then World War II intervened. There weren't enough workers to cook meals. Many kids were left without meals again. The National School Lunch Act was finally passed in 1946, but the program still relied on agricultural surplus. Meanwhile, the American economy was on the rise. Food production expanded dramatically. By 1952, school lunches had become a $415 million business. Private companies began contracting with school districts. Children were fed rich protein-heavy dishes. The 1960s introduced pizza, chili con carne, and enchiladas. These foods used to be considered ethnic. Now they were served in school cafeterias. Many school districts centralized their lunch production. By the 1970s, fast food had completely taken over. Burgers, hot dogs, fried chicken, candy bars, all this was on the menu. The 1979 USDA guidelines approved of this. School lunches, they said, only needed to provide minimal nutritional value. Ketchup was classed as a vegetable in the 1980s. Lunchables also appeared in that decade. It's one of the best-selling children's products of all time. In the 1990s, many schools had fast food franchises. McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Little Caesars, and others set up shop in schools. The schools happily accepted their money. Childhood obesity rates began to climb. So did public concern. School lunches got healthier in the 2000s. Most schools added fresh fruit and vegetables. In 2010, President Obama signed the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. Michelle Obama launched the Let's Move initiative. Healthy eating gained cultural momentum, but nutrition requirements were suspended during COVID-19. Today, only 8 states offer universal free school lunch.